Well, good morning. Welcome to Space Oddities. We've done a bit of an impromptu broadcast this morning for various technical reasons, but we're here. And we're delighted to welcome back to Space Oddities Mr. Brian Harvey. Now, Brian did join us on Space Oddities a little while ago, but he had audio issues. So what we thought we'd do, we'd invite him back so that we can have a proper chat without the problems. How are you, Brian?
Very well indeed, thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
That's an absolute pleasure. Brian is a fellow of the British Interplanetary Society. He's been writing and broadcasting about spaceflight and space programs since the 1970s. Gosh, that sounds awful, doesn't it? Yeah, for a few years. And he's written many books. He's written articles for magazines. He's done a lot of broadcasting. And he knows a lot about not just, the usual space programs you think of with spaceflight, the British and American. Well, you don't think of the British one, but certainly the American and the Russians. Brian knows a lot about the Chinese space program, the Japanese space program. So he's an absolute mine of information about anything to do with the exploration of space. I'm also joined this morning by Michael. How are you, Michael?
Fine, thank you.
Yeah, right. Awake are we today?
Of course.
Yes, good. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Michael now for a chat with Brian.
Yeah. Good morning, Brian. Nice
to good morning, Michael.
Again. Yeah. I'd like to take you back to the beginning, if you wouldn't mind, and talk about how you first got interested in spaceflight and when you realized that you wanted to become an author and that sort of thing. Yeah.
My interest in spaceflight goes back to when I was actually a small child and was brought out into the back garden one evening where my aunt told me a spaceship is going to fly over in the next few minutes, and I saw this bright, small but bright object crossing the sky from the southwest to the southeast, and she said, there's somebody in that. And it turned out that it was the second Russian cosmonaut, German Titov, to fly around the world. And I thought this was rather intriguing, exciting. So since then, I followed the space programs of the United States and Soviet Union in the usual way through radio, television when it arrived, and so on and so forth. My interest in writing about it, I think, went as far back probably even as school magazines. But my first significant book, I believe, was called Race into Space, which was published by Ellis Howard of Chichester, now part of Springer Praxis. And it was about the Soviet space program at the end of what turned out to be the end of the Soviet period. And in the 1980s, we went through the period of what was called glasnost, or openness. So we began to find out a lot more about what was really going on. The fact that we were dealing with a program where you had to work a bit harder to find out what was happening of itself, I think, made things interesting. But certainly there was no difficulty in accumulating sufficient material to tell the story of what had been the Russian space program up to that particular point. And from then on, China, as Andy was pointing out, became an area of my interest. The same was also true, because in the 1990s, we knew very little about China's space program. Now it's quite a dominant one in the world, but that was not the case. It was very much seen as an also ran in the far distance in the 1990s, but not anymore.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, so we move on to the your involvement with the British Interplanetary Society. I understand you're a fellow member of the BIS, is that right?
The British Interplanetary Society introduced something that was really important and really valuable in the early 1980s, which was the annual Soviet Space Forum, where those of us who were interested in it could gather together, make presentations to one another, share our knowledge and experience. It's very easy to do that in the internet age, but in those days we were dependent on getting books or magazines from bookshops like Collett's in London, for example, writing away to the Soviet embassy. We all did that to get their publications, following their program on Radio Moscow English Language Service, Soviet Weekly, and so on. And it was really interesting and fun to find out that there were other people about whom we hitherto didn't realize, who were independently working on the same issue. So the British Interplanetary Forum on the Soviet space program later added China to that list, which was a good thing as well. Was a really invaluable opportunity for us sharing our knowledge, testing our knowledge against other people, being corrected when we got things wrong, which all of us, myself included, managed to do from time to time. And it was a unique forum in the whole world. I know of no other country where there was a similar type of regular annual event. Sadly, it was discontinued as that in 2022, but it did make a really huge contribution, I think, to our knowledge, and people used to come to it from all over the world, including some people who we have good reason to believe were in the intelligence services and who wanted to know what we knew.
Oh, I see. Really? Okay. Yeah, I do remember many years ago attending one of those forums, in London, which is really good. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah. So I take it your interest in Russian spaceflight was sparked by your initial viewing of that satellite when you were a small boy. Yeah.
Yes, it was, and then as I said a moment ago, I went on to China. It's rather interesting. I do get invitations from time to time to speak to principally amateur astronomy societies, but also library associations and so on. And China seems to be, and has been for about 10 to 15 years, the principal area of interest. And what many people say to me is, why don't we know more about China? Why is so little said about China in our newspapers, on our, I have to be careful with the terminology here, mainstream media, because they say we're not being told enough about China. And they're very surprised to learn that the Chinese have done what they have done. Sometimes this is attributed to the Chinese not telling us, but that, in my view, is not the case at all. They've been telling us plenty. We'd always could do with more, but they've been telling us sufficient for us to have a much better knowledge about China than we do. And in fact, my original book on China, which came out in the late 1990s, has been updated now. And the current one, which is also available in Chinese, is the fourth one that I've written.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Very good. So, do you think China will reach the moon before America?
Well, I don't know how far the Chinese space program will go at the moment. It's certainly China is one of the three what are called full spectrum space programs. Full spectrum being that you have the capacity to do all the things that are done in space, particularly including human spaceflight. Europe does not yet have the ability to launch its own astronauts into orbit, although it tried to develop the Hermes spaceplane, which might have done that. And India does have aspirations to be a full spectrum space power, and they've already done the first tests of their spaceship called the Gaganyaan, and do hope to build a space station in Earth orbit in the next decade. So then we will have 4 full spectrum space powers.
All right, that's good. So with your books, then, how many have you written so far?
Well, you've obliged me to go and look them up and make a count. So I have about 20 altogether.
That's brilliant.
Most of them are on Russian and China. And for example, in the area of Russia, I wrote one with a Russian colleague, Olga Zakutnia, on Russian space science. Which looked at their scientific achievements of the purely scientific side of their space program. One of the things that astonished me was how they had published so much on it, yet that was not really becoming part of the Western intellectual circles or whatever. They even obligingly did so in English, so we've no excuse not to know. I also wrote books separately on the Soviet lunar program, the Soviet planetary exploration program, and have also covered Europe as well. And some of the emerging space powers. And there seems to be, by publishers at least, an interest in what I would call national program summaries. In other words, what is the accumulated knowledge that we have about a particular country? Where can we put it together all under one roof? And it's not just the information, it's about the analysis, it's about the comparison, it's about the different values, procedures, approaches, so we can learn how each country does things differently.
Okay, thank you for that. And coming on to Europe then, we touched before about the original European Hermes spaceplane program, which sadly got cancelled. But technologies and processes from that program went into the production of the automated transfer vehicle and so forth. Can you talk about that?
The Hermes spaceplane that you mentioned there was a brave endeavor to develop a space plane. Now, developing space planes is difficult. It's very hard. One would think that combining aviation and space technology should be quite easy. But in fact, Europe was not able to do it. By contrast, the Russians did develop a space plane called the Bor, B-O-R, on which the American Dream Chaser is very closely modeled. The US Air Force has a space plane. China has a space plane. The European project, and I believe that Europe probably did have the technical capacity to do it, but it did it at the worst possible time, because there was quite a lot of division within the European Space Agency at the time, and also the reunification of Germany happened rather unexpectedly and suddenly, and the budget that Germany could contribute to the European Space Agency was temporarily rather diminished. So it was a good project, the right idea, unfortunately the wrong time. So I think it was a missed opportunity. Europe's other missed opportunity, I think, was in not developing reusable rockets sooner. There was actually a program developed by Europe with the Russian Federation in the early 2000s called Barzugin, in which they were looking together at reusable rockets when they were considered very speculative. But that program kind of disappeared somewhere into the sands. But meanwhile, it was, as we all know, SpaceX that pushed ahead very successfully, leaving Europe, indeed Japan, with still what we would call the earlier type of non-reusable rocket. But I think that was a missed opportunity by Europe not to have done that, instead of proceeding to the more conventional, but which I think we all hope will be successful, Ariane 6.
Yes, that's right. We're looking forward to that. With the I mentioned the ATV, the automated transfer vehicle. So Europe has been involved in human space flight, albeit not launching their own astronauts. Can you talk a little bit about the ATV and that story there?
I'm sorry, could you give that to me again, please?
Can you talk about the ATV and the Europe's involvement with the ISS?
I'm sorry, I'm not getting that. Andy, could you repeat that to me, please?
Yeah, sure. The automated transfer vehicle, the European automated transfer vehicle, could you talk a little about that and the involvement with the ISS?
Yes, of course. I'm sorry. The automated transfer vehicle was Europe's very specific, valuable contribution to the International Space Station. There were two cargo ships essentially developed by the ISS partners. One was the HTV, to bring up cargo, developed by Japan. The Americans developed their own cargo ships, the Dragon cargo version and the Cygnus cargo version. I think one of the things that we didn't really expect when the ISS was built was just how much cargo you need to bring up to a space station. Although the astronauts try to recycle their own water there. You still need water brought up, you need clothes brought up, you certainly need food brought up, you need scientific equipment brought up. So Europe developed this very successful automated transfer vehicle, which flew, I think, 7 times, if I remember correctly, up to the ISS. The Japanese flew their HTV up 9 times, and in fact, the Japanese HTV will become the basis of the HTV-XG, the G being Gateway, which will fly up to the American Artemis lunar gateway. So that technology which Japan has developed and developed very successfully will continue to play an important part in space exploration. On the Russian side, they have the Progress spacecraft, which is comparable to the Soyuz, and it brings up, it's about 2.5 tons of supplies. 3 or 4 times a year. There's a launching due later this year. It's among the smaller of the two, but it's very regular and very reliable.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And what about the effects of the invasion of Ukraine on both European and spaceflight in general?
Okay, it's very interesting that when the invasion of Ukraine took place, there were diametrically opposite reactions to that by the United States on the one hand and by Europe on the other. In the United States, there were conversations between NASA and the Congress, and their view was very speedily, unanimously said, we want to continue to work with Russia on the International Space Station. So that work was quite unaffected. And only a few weeks ago, another American astronaut, Donald Pettit, was launched to the International Space Station from Russia on the Soyuz spacecraft.
Yeah.
By contrast, Europe, the European Space Agency, convened, and this was really quite surprising, an emergency meeting over the following weekend and made what seems to be a rather rushed decision into cutting off all contacts of any kind whatsoever with Russia. The lights burned late in the departments of government responsible for space affairs during the weekend that followed. It's still not clear to me why they couldn't have waited till the following week or weekday week. It is certainly the case that the core issue was ExoMars, which was the joint European-Russian project in which Britain has a very big involvement in Stevenage to drill for life on Mars. And that spacecraft was almost ready to be shipped to Moscow and then on to Baikonur for launch. But we were talking about weeks, not days. So you had this very sudden decision over a weekend. One would have thought that the governments of Europe might have had other things on their mind during that particular weekend, but drilling for life in Mars seems to have taken priority over anything else. We do not know the basis on which ESA took that decision. We do not know who proposed the cancellation of ExoMars and the breaking off of all contact with Russia. We do not know who opposed it. We do not know the considerations that were taken into account. We know that up to 25 documents were involved in that decision, but the European Space Agency has absolutely refused to disclose any information whatsoever on how it came to that decision. I've no particular views with you as to the merits of that decision, but I think both as a journalist and a historian, we are entitled to know more than nothing about how that decision came to be made and when it was the exact opposite of the American decision. The effects, though, are clear. ExoMars was cancelled. Efforts are being made to have it fly again in 2028, but that contract was only agreed this year. And 4 years is not actually a lot of time to completely redesign a spacecraft and rebuild a spacecraft and build a new lander to get it to Mars. So that is a risky whether they can achieve that time schedule. ESA closed its Moscow office the following week. ESA turned off all European instruments, as did its member states, that were on the Russian segment on the International Space Station.
Yeah.
Germany turned off its deep space telescope, the E Rosita, which was on the Spectre Space Observatory. So they cut themselves off from all their future data. Equipment that was designed to fly to the moon on Luna 27 was recalled. Other instrumentation was taken off Luna 25 and Luna 27. So it was an absolute cut. It was absolutely everything, and a determination never ever to have business again with Russia. And that does, of course, contrast to the Cold War, when science was considered one of the unifying factors. So that is the degree to which politics have changed the world in the past 2 years, that whereas science was seen as a unifying international thing to do, now it's seen as it's now seen as divisive.
Yeah, and even the European spaceport in French Guiana shows off all the Soyuz launches from that site as well, and the Russian people that was working there.
You're absolutely right. And the building of the Soyuz launch base in Guyana was the biggest engineering project in the world in the first 10 years of the 20th century. And now it is being reclaimed by the jungle, although I hear a contract is out to, quote, repurpose it. But I understand that there were at least 2 Soyuz rockets there that were not far off flying, and they are, I presume, rusting away in the jungle rain.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh dear.
Okay, that's a very interesting historical episode, really, isn't it? You know.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I'll tell you what it reminded me of. It reminded me of the film 2010.
Yes, I was thinking that myself. Yeah.
Where the Americans and the Russians have to separate themselves and not have anything to do with each other.
Yeah.
Because
science fiction does become science fiction occasionally.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. Well, I mean, thank goodness in this case it wasn't the threat of a nuclear war.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, definitely.
But yeah.
Yeah. So, Brian, a bit of something else to finish the main questions. Do you have a favourite space moment?
Yes, and I didn't find that a very difficult one to come up with. It's a good question, but I think that some of us belong to that minority of the world population now that can actually remember the landing on the moon. In 1969, we're a diminishing group, demographically speaking, but I do have a very, very vivid memory of every single moment of that descent to the moon, because it was so much, it was the most edge of your seat stuff you're ever going to experience on your whole life. You had the landing astronauts calling out, or the capsule communicator calling out 30 seconds of fuel left, which, as somebody once said to me, gives the name of range anxiety a whole new meaning. And then the huge relief when they did finally land. So it was very tense, and the margin between complete success and a dreadful, disastrous failure was not that very wide. And then if you look back at the film taken in Mission Control, and we've seen that in some of the more recent documentaries on Apollo 11, you see the mission controllers just looking, staring in disbelief at the pictures back from the surface of the moon during the spacewalk. They've a smile on their faces, but they still can't really believe that we've done this at last. And they are just literally gobsmacked. There's nothing they say. It's complete silence. There's nothing you can say when you watch such a dramatic event for several hours. And I would certainly share that. In those days, not every individual had a television set. I remember watching it with a group of, I think, 50 other people, many of whom had no particular interest in the area, but they stayed up all night and they just watched in complete silence, disbelief, and utter amazement. And you can never take away a moment like that.
And that watching the TV with a group of people came out in the film Apollo 13 as well, didn't it? remember.
Indeed, and Apollo 13 is not very far behind, particularly
Yeah.
waiting for the moments when the parachutes did
Oh, yes,
eventually open,
exactly.
and you the spectacle of
Yeah.
Odyssey, Houston, the call going in, and the signal from the cabin saying, yes, we are here, and then the parachutes opening. We to wait an awful long time. It seemed like a lifetime for that to come right. So that would be my second moment for you.
Okay.
I think when the night that Apollo 11 landed, I was really impressed for really two reasons. Firstly, I was so happy when I opened my eyes that my parents had remembered to wake me. I was so worried they'd forget. But they didn't. They woke me up in the early hours, and then, seeing the landing itself was just...
Well, I'm a bit different to that, because I was told by my parents that I watched it, but I don't physically remember watching it live. Yes. Obviously, we've watched it millions of times since. So,
No, I remember it very vividly. You don't forget things like that. Yeah. And it's just, it's just a tragedy that so many people now believe it never happened.
Exactly, yeah.
I don't know what we do about that. I don't think there's anything you can do about
that. You can't. There's nothing you can do about that, unfortunately.
No. But we know, guys, don't we? We know. We were there.
We definitely were there.
Yeah.
Staying with the moon then, Brian, what about Russia and China building a base on the moon? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, apparently I'm told that the smart money is moving to China being next on the moon. China has said that it does plan to land astronauts on the moon in 2029. That's a definitive date that they have now given us. And to underline the point, they demonstrated with male and female models, a Hang Tian Yuan, to use the Chinese word for astronaut, cosmonaut. Zhai Zhigang modeled the male lunar suit, and Yang Huaping modeled the female suit. So that shows a seriousness of intent. I think it's worth saying, though, that although the Americans think that this is a race to get back to the moon or to the moon first, that's not how the Chinese see it. The Chinese announced this as an objective, although they didn't give a date, as far back as 2009, when they issued what was called the Roadmap 2050, in which they outlined in extraordinary detail all their space plans until 2050. And that included a lunar landing round about 2030. And indeed, the American decision to go back to the moon in its current shape, Artemis, was not taken until President Trump in 2017. I think what has happened is a couple of things have happened here. First of all, although the American commitment was to get back to the moon by 2024, we're still in the last few months of 2024, a long way behind that. That was supposed to be Artemis 3, but Artemis 2 has yet to fly. The American launcher, the Space Launch System, is experiencing a lot of difficulty, problems of weight and so on. The Starship, which NASA then added to the plan, is a very radical type of rocket, much bigger on a huger scale than anything that has ever been done before. And I would have to add, although I'm not an engineer, it seems to me a somewhat risky approach. By contrast, the Chinese plan to get back to the moon looks rather like, well, Apollo. It's conservative. That's the point I want to make.
Because it worked.
Yes.
And if Apollo worked, I think there's a reasonable chance that the Chinese system, there are some differences in the way they go into that, but it's largely the same idea with spacecraft that don't look a million miles different from the Apollo command and service module. That's called the Mengtian. And then the lander is a developed version of something that does not look greatly different from the American LEM, the Lunar Excursion Module. And also the Chinese have already flown a lot of the rocketry that they're going to need. They've done a lot of the homework. Their lunar program recently has been hugely successful with the first far side landing automated in 2019. Lunar sample return on the near side, Chang'e 5, And then this year, a sample returned from the lunar far side, Chang'e 6, something that no other country has ever done. And it seems to have gone like clockwork. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, the gap between failure and success can be worryingly narrow. China could yet experience setbacks. It may well be that the Americans will sort out their problems relatively speedily. But at the moment, it looks rather like a tortoise and hare situation in which the tortoise, which is China, which began to design this quite some time ago, will, as you know, the tortoise wins these races.
Yes, exactly. Okay, then, Brian, that's a really good insight in what's happening at the moment. Finally, then, a serious question, I think. Do you think Western countries need to take Russia's use of space weapons seriously?
There were reports were issued earlier this year of Russia planning to put weapons in space.
Yeah.
And that was accentuated by an anti-satellite test called Noodle, which Russia did do in a couple of years ago. I think that the world expert on this issue is Bart Hendricks, who is somebody who we all know through the British Interplanetary Society, Soviet Space Forum, and he is the expert on this. He knows and speaks Russian. He reads Russian. He has looked at all the Russian literature in the area, and what he says is we can't collaborate these claims that Russia is developing a space weapon. And he has looked at the whole types of weapons that could be developed, like electromagnetic pulse, like plasma guns and Star Wars-y things like that. Certainly it is the case that they've done some of the theoretical and laboratory work on it. Yeah. But then they're probably not the only country in the world doing that kind of thing.
Right.
But in effect, I think if he's saying that if we're looking for evidence of a imminent Russian threat in this area, it's not there. And we need to be, I think, a little more measured and temperate in how we look at these things at a time of rather raised political temperatures, tensions, and so on. So I think it's important to be rather cautious and say, what is Russia's intentions? And they say they're not going to do this. What is Russia's past? Well, has Russia developed anti-satellite capabilities? Yes, but so has the United States, which actually developed them first. So has India. So has China. So they're in a club of at least four on this. I think the suggestion that this is some kind of imminent threat, I suspect, is quite exaggerated.
Right. Okay, then. That's well, we've all got to feel safe. So let's hope they're limited to satellite in orbit. So
because when the Americans said they're up to something, their plan is to put nuclear bombs in space, and then it turned out no, it wasn't nuclear bombs, but perhaps some sort of weapon that would deliver an EMP pulse that will be nuclear powered. But I mean, for the Americans to exhibit this degree of paranoia, let's not forget the American Star Wars project, where they were trying to fill the skies with weapons.
Well, Star Wars was not the first such Strangelove type project of its kind. The worst debris incident ever in space was on the 9th of May 1963, because there was a fear in the United States that Russian ships would cut the undersea communications cables across the Atlantic. So the US Air Force came up with a bright idea of let's put a whole cloud of needles into orbit so that we can reflect our signals in the future off this big cloud. And on that day, 480 million needles were put into an orbit of 3,500 to 3,800 kilometers,
Right.
and 36 clusters of them are still there.
Really?
It's the worst ever space pollution incident,
know about this.
based on the notion of being able to bounce electric waves off these needles, which don't seem to have worked anyway. So that I think we have to be rather wary of these Dr. Strangelove type devices, because this is one that not only was tested, but actually came to fruition. And of course, the other one, of course, was the big nuclear explosion in space, which was Starfish, which was in 1962. One of the dangers of putting in weapons in space, and this happened in Starfish, was you destroy your own satellites. As well as the enemy satellites.
Did they lose Telstar during that?
Yes. And one of the, in fact, there were two prominent victims to the Starfish nuclear explosion in 1962. One was the Telstar communication satellite. The other was Britain's first satellite, the Ariel 1.
That's right.
Which went off air, and there was all kind of political discussion of, shall we tell the British that we did this or not? And an agreement, I think, by government not to draw too much attention to this unfortunate outcome. There was, though, one good outcome to Starfish, was that the following year, pretty well exactly, John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev signed the agreement to ban nuclear explosions in space. And that began a process of de-escalation, and nothing as mad as the Needles incident nor Starfish have followed in quite the same way since. But I also fear, as I think many people do, that we're in rather dangerous territory again at the moment.
Yeah. Okay.
They're all mad, I tell you. They're all mad.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Brian. And I think that brings us to the end of the questions.
Yes, I don't think we need to keep you any longer, Brian. So we'd like to obviously thank you a huge amount for coming back.
Yeah, thanks for coming back. Definitely.
You know, we did want to do it because you really have a chance to speak.
And of course, if you ever want to come on the show again as well, the live show in the evening.
Absolutely. So we'd like to say thank you to Brian. For having a most interesting chat. Have you got any more books in the pipeline, Brian?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity.
That's okay. Have you got any more books?
Yes, I'm writing one which touches very closely on what we've just been discussing, which is called Space Alliances. It's for Praxis Springer again, and it's looking at the politics and diplomacy of the space world. Who makes allies with who makes, by contrast, enemies with who or against who. Also, I'm looking at the cross alliances where countries do business together, like, for example, the Apollo-Soyuz test project in the mid-1970s, like the International Space Station itself. Like at the moment, the world is very much divided into what we call a bipolar world. After Artemis was announced in 2017, the Americans began to sign up their friends and supporters to it, what we'll call the Artemis Accords. China and Russia announced the International Lunar Research Station in 2021. And since then, the leaders of the space agencies of these respective countries have been crisscrossing the world to try to sign up their different friends and supporters, principally in the global south. And I'm surprised they haven't actually met one another in the arrivals or departures lounges of airports in the course of them doing this, for example, in Africa, because I think some of them have been in the same countries at almost the same time. It is echoes of the great game in the mid-19th century of international diplomatic intrigue, except it's around the space world this time. And so it's very interesting to look at the different models of space cooperation, who gets what out of it, who benefits most, who benefits least. Is it a really equal trade between the different partners or not? Which models work well, which don't? Why do countries cooperate across boundaries? If you could contrast, for example, the plan by President Kennedy, which Nikita Khrushchev was on the verge of accepting in 1963 when Kennedy was assassinated. That's a very big what if, isn't it? Of space history. It could have been a joint venture. There are still things that could be joint ventures now, but may or may not be. But if we can get this knowledge together, analyze it and so on, it should be a guide as to how this has been done and how it could be done in the future.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, really look forward to that.
Well, we wish you the best of luck with that. That sounds a most interesting book, like all your books. So it's, I will definitely go out of my way to read that one.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you.
Subject. All right then, Brian. Well, thank you for being here. I'm so glad that your audio worked okay this time. So that's a definite plus. So take care of yourself and keep in touch. Perhaps you can come back if you ever have anything you want to talk about. Don't hesitate to get in touch. And you can join us on the show.
Okay, thank you then.
All right, take care.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you.
So thank you to our audience for joining us today. Just to let you know what's coming up at the weekend, we've got two things happening on Sunday. We've got the launch of Europa Clipper. Full details are on the channel. Hang on, just let me tell you what time that is happening. Yeah, we go live on Sunday at... hang on 1 second. I don't know myself. Right. So we go live on Sunday at 16:45 UK time to cover the launch of Europa Clipper, NASA's mission to Jupiter's moon. We've also got the launch of Starship, which is meant to be happening on Sunday. We have no time for that yet. We know it's happening because yesterday SpaceX fitted the FTS, the flight termination system, to the spacecraft, which they only do a few days before the launch. So it looks like it's definitely happening. SpaceX have said they are flying on Sunday. They haven't got official FAA clearance yet to do that. They haven't got their launch license. So we don't know what's happening, but it looks like it's going ahead on Sunday. And as we've been saying on our Facebook page, which you should certainly join our Facebook group. If you're a subscriber to the channel, you can join the Space Oddities Live Facebook group. And we've been saying that, if they were to launch without FAA approval, without the license, they'll be in a world of legal trouble, and it would have ramifications for their NASA contracts and their clients and their investors. And it's just not going to happen. It would be suicidal for SpaceX to launch without an FAA license.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they obviously know something we don't, because the launch is happening on Sunday, apparently. Yeah. So anyway, stay tuned to the Facebook group. We'll announce when we're going live as soon as we get a launch time, which has not, as I said, hasn't been announced yet. But this is IFT5, the Integrated Flight Test 5.
Yeah.
And the major thing that will differ between this and IFT4 is that SpaceX are actually planning to catch the returning Super Heavy booster in midair back at Boca Chica with those enormous chopstick mechanical arms called the chopsticks. And this is obviously this is pure Thunderbirds catching. I mean, it is, isn't it, Michael? You could see that happening in a Thunderbirds episode and thinking, nah, they can't do that. But they are planning to catch a returning rocket in midair with little arms, and we won't know until after the spacecraft is launched whether that's going to happen, because it depends on the health of the spacecraft and what's happening. They're not going to make that decision until after the Starship has separated from the booster. If the person in charge decides they're not going to go for the catch, the booster will return to the Earth and splash down in the Gulf of Mexico, and the Starship will continue in its path around the Earth and come down in the Indian Ocean. So it looks like it's going to be excitement guaranteed yet again.
Okay.
But we just hope that Europa Clipper and Starship don't launch at the same time.
Yes.
But I don't think that's going to happen. Starship, I think, will be launching earlier because they have a launch window. Well, they normally open for business at 9 in the morning.
Yeah.
And it could be any time after that. So it takes maybe an hour and 3/4, 2 hours to get everything fueled and ready. So anyway, basically I'm yabbering. Keep an eye on the Facebook group, and we'll announce exactly what's happening there. Yeah. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us this morning. As I said right at the top of the show, it was an impromptu, unplanned live broadcast this morning because we had technical difficulties recording it as we originally had planned to do. But never mind. We hope you've enjoyed it. Brian is a fascinating guy, and as you could tell if you've been watching, an absolute mine of information about space programs. I don't know how he manages to cram all that in his head, but and he's a lovely guy, and we love chatting to him again. So anyway, until Sunday on Space Oddities, keep your eye on the Facebook group, keep your eye on the YouTube channel, and we will see you very